Welcome to the Assembly Committee on Ways and Means and Senate Committee on Finance Subcommittees on K-12, Higher Education, and CIP. Will the Secretary please call the roll?
Senators Canizaro, Scheibel, Buck, Stone, Dondero Loop, Assembly Members Hafen, Howdigi, Koenig, Monroe Moreno, O'Neill, Torres Fawcett, Yeager, and Chair Backus.
And I am present. Please mark Senator Canizaro and Assembly Member Hafen present when they arrive. And also please mark Assembly Member Hibbett's absent excused. At this time, we'd like to welcome everyone here in Carson City, as well as those attending in Las Vegas, as those watching over Zoom this morning. For a little assistance today, if you are offering any testimony, always please remember to state your name. If not, we'll kind of interrupt you. I know we have a pretty lengthy schedule, but most of you guys are experienced, and I anticipate that will go smoothly. But at the end of today's agenda, we will have public comment, and at such time, if anyone's calling in to give public comment, I would just ask that they state and spell their name. It makes our secretary taking minutes a lot easier. And at the end of today's hearing, the public comment or testimony could obviously be made in person here in Carson City as well as in Las Vegas. If you wish to call in to make public comment, the telephone today is 888-475-4499. When prompted, provide the meeting ID, enter 892-2202-0226, and then press the number sign when prompted for participant ID. With that, I am excited to welcome Megan Peterson up to the dais, as well as anyone else that will be presenting the Nevada Department of Education's pupil-centered funding plan account. And then we'll start with that account number, and then we will go to the education stabilization account, and then the account for state special education services. And I know you may need to move people around or maybe not. So welcome, and please feel free to begin when you're ready.
Good morning, Chair, members of the committee, Deputy Superintendent Megan Peterson for the record. Please let me know if my voice is not projecting while I'm recovering a little bit, as I know many people are, from our lovely viruses that are going around. Okay, let's go to the next slide. As the Chair mentioned, we'll be going over 3 budget accounts today, 2 of which pertain specifically to the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan, Budget Account 2609 and 2608, followed by our State Special Education Account, Budget Account 2619. Okay, we'll start today, Megan Peterson for the record, with a quick overview of the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan. Beginning in the 2019 legislative session, SB 543 was passed, which revised the then 52-year-old Nevada plan, updating it with what's now referred to as the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan. For the first time, this plan combined all revenues to fund education, both locally raised and state funded, into one account to provide a basic level of support for each pupil in the public education system. These funds are adjusted to account for local variations that occur within the districts, so that way they are distributed equitably across the districts and charter schools. And what's important to note about this that's different from many of the other budget accounts in the state is that this is a revenue-driven model for distribution of these funds. Many of our other accounts are expenditure-driven. So this means that when our economy is doing well, it has a direct impact on our K-12 education funding and allows those districts and students to experience the increases in those revenues as well. So for a quick overview, the pupil-centered funding plan allows for the combination of over 26 different revenues into one account. This slide shows you at a high level most of those revenues, and these are then used to contribute to the distribution of the funds that are managed through budget account 2609. It's frequently referred to as the State Education Fund. The revenue does come into Fund 203 and then is distributed through this account. And these do include revenues like marijuana fees that are distributed back to the school districts. The revenues are then distributed across 4 different tiers within the pupil-centered funding plan. These funds are used to pay for things within the auxiliary services tier, which includes food services and transportation, then flows through to our local special education, and then through to adjusted base funding, and then our weighted categories. And we'll talk about these a little bit more in future slides, but this is a quick overview of those funds. And then in instances where there may be unexpended funds, either because there was a decline in, not a decline, but a less than projected enrollment is observed, or if revenues come in at a higher rate than projected, the residual funding does transfer at the end of the year to budget account 2608, which is the education stabilization account, and acts as the rainy day fund for this account. In the event that funds within the budget account 2608 exceed 20% of the authorizations or appropriations for budget account 2609, then the funds transfer back to assist in increasing the per pupil amount distributed through the pupil-centered funding plan. On this slide, you'll see the different revenues broken out or combined based on where they are raised. So blue representing the locally raised revenues, green are other state revenues. I'm sorry, yellow is the other state revenues, and green represents the general fund investment for fiscal year 26 and 27. This slide provides a table showing the recommended revenues based on the economic forum projections reflected in the governor's recommended budget. At a detailed level, you can see each of what those are projected to be received at. And then I wanted to highlight one of the revenues that is received and distributed within the pupil-centered funding plan are known as the net proceeds of minerals. These are constitutionally protected for the districts and are required to be paid back to the districts in the event that the pupil-centered funding plan revenues don't meet what was raised at the local level. So in the instance of, for example, Esmeralda County, if they were to raise $10 million in net proceeds of minerals and through the pupil-centered funding plan, they only received $9 million, we would send back that additional $1 million to them to keep locally in their districts. Those are earned in 1 year of the biennium and then used in the second year. And so you can see the flow of those dollars in fiscal year 26. They're highlighted in yellow on this slide. We receive them in fiscal year 26. They're transferred from 26 to 27 and then expended in fiscal year 27. This is a mechanism that we manage through the monthly payment book, and it's not necessarily reflected within the pupil-centered funding plan model itself. This slide shows you, based on the recommended budget from the governor, what the anticipated statewide base per pupil amount is. Fiscal year 26, it's $9,416, which is a $2 increase over fiscal year 25. And fiscal year 27 is a approximately $70 increase to $94.84. And before we go on into the rest of the presentation and explain how these funds are then distributed within the model, I wanted to pause and highlight a provision that was put in place for the pupil-centered funding plan. It's commonly referred to a hold harmless provision, but because we acknowledge that it truly doesn't necessarily hold districts in a hold harmless status because the increasing costs are not necessarily reflected, we frequently recall to it the fiscal year 20 baseline funding. And this was put in place when we transitioned to the pupil-centered funding plan to help mitigate the transition for districts who would have received less money under the pupil-centered funding plan than prior to the start of the pupil-centered funding plan. And it maintains that same per pupil amount for those districts who qualify. Currently, there are still 3 districts in this status. That's Esmeralda, Eureka, and Story. These are districts who have historically had greater than typical revenues distributed through the plan due to their net proceeds of minerals. And so they have exceptionally high per pupil rates also because of their low enrollment and the high fixed costs for educating their children. So these districts, as we go through the distributions, because they would have received less, they are paid on this fiscal year 20 amount, and they do not receive the allocations that the other districts receive. However, they have the flexibility to distribute those funds in the same way that people who receive pupil-centered funding plan money would. So as I mentioned earlier, there are 4 tiers that the revenues, the approximately $6 billion in each year that the funding flows through, tier 1, 2, 3, and 4. The first 2 tiers, the funds are essentially removed off the top and distributed directly back to the districts based on 2 or 3 different methodologies. Transportation is based on a 4-year average of their expenditures as reported in the 387 report. Slide. And then local special education, because of maintenance of effort requirements, these funds are distributed based on the immediately prior fiscal year's allocations in order to maintain that level of funding for them. As I mentioned, these funds come out of the waterfall first in order to ensure that the districts receive exactly the funding that they expended in these areas. Within the governor's recommended budget, there was also an inclusion of additional funds for transportation for charter schools, as well as funding to support the salary adjustments that were made available through SB 231. These were added to this tier of funding as well in line with how we manage the local special education funding. This ensures that the dollars go back to the districts in which the way they were negotiated with the labor unions. So within the governor's recommended budget for fiscal year 26 and 27, approximately $200 million was allocated for transportation, $1 million was allocated for food services, and then for the school district salary adjustment, and then a proportion identified for charter schools, approximately $144 million in each year of the biennium are identified in this tier of funding for districts and charter schools. This table shows you what those allocations look like at the local education or school district level, and then it's rolled up under the charter school sponsor to represent that LEA function. And these are the amounts for fiscal year 26 and 27 based on what was reported within the 3D7303 report. That information is received by the department in November, and we continue to work with districts and charter schools currently to validate and certify those numbers. We're hoping to have that wrapped up by the end of March. We've had a lot of learning opportunities in norming on our language to make sure that the data is accurate and aligned, and so we do anticipate that these numbers may change just slightly as we finish validating that report with them. Our next tier of funding, as I mentioned, is local special education. It's treated in the same manner as I discussed. This is the local portion of funding that school districts and charter schools use to support special education services for the students who qualify under an individualized education plan. There are 3 components to special education funding in our state. This represents just one of those tiers and is representative of the local level of investment. Within the governor's recommended budget, this is identified at $597 million in each year of the biennium. And as I mentioned, this does not receive an inflation adjustment because this is based on their actual expenditures. And as that changes based on their expenditures, we reflect it through the 387 and updated bienniums. This table again shows you the allocations based on the reports received from the school districts for fiscal year 26 and 27. You'll see that some districts are missing information that's reported as zero. We are continuing to work with them to validate and understand how they are reflecting these dollars. This is a challenge that has come up with the transition to the pupil-centered funding plan, and so we are still working with them to clean these numbers up, but this is the best information we had at the time that we had received it. Moving on to the third tier of funding, this is where the statewide base per pupil amount comes into play, that 9416 or the 9484 that we had mentioned earlier. That amount is the statewide average after we remove the funding for the first two tiers, and then is divided based on the projected enrollment. The statewide base per pupil amount then goes through adjustments based on the local level for each school district and the charter school based on where it is located within a district. The two adjustments for this are known as the Nevada cost of education and the attendance area adjustments. We'll go into those a little bit more detail in the next few slides. But that's the difference between the statewide base and the adjusted base as we talk about those numbers moving forward. And for a little bit of background and information, as I mentioned, the statewide base is divided based on the projected number of pupils to be enrolled. These two slides give you some historical information and trends that we observe within enrollment for the governor's recommended budget based on the last 3 to 4 years of enrollment trends. It appears to be leveling, and so we provided flat enrollment for the fiscal year 26 and 27 projections. However, you can see on the table on the left, quarterly there are fluctuations within how the enrollment trends. Second quarter historically has a peak in enrollment, and that corresponds with October's report. And then as the year continues, there tends to be a slight decline from third quarter and fourth quarter. But overall, it has been relatively flat since the pandemic. This slide provides a table with what that projected enrollment looks like at the school district level, and then for our SPCSA sponsored charter schools as a whole. That LEA, the SPCSA charter schools in general, have been our fastest growing LEA, and they are now the second largest school district, if you will, in our state. They have outpaced Washoe County, and so this does have implications for funding in other areas as well. Okay, so as I mentioned, the statewide base per pupil amount, it goes through two different adjustments to account for variation of costs within the districts. As I mentioned, this is the attendance area and the Nevada cost of education index. These are multipliers that are applied to that statewide base to come up with an individual amount for each district, and that becomes the adjusted base. And there is an adjusted base per pupil amount that is calculated for each school district, so the amounts do vary, and that number is then multiplied by the projected enrollment to come up with the total allocations that we'll see at the end of the presentation. So for a little more information on the attendance area adjustment, this is to account for the increased costs that it takes to operate schools that are located in lower population density areas. Frequently, these are geographically distanced from our city population. So if you think of Reno and Sparks compared to Gerlach, Gerlach would be a school that qualifies in this instance for an attendance area adjustment. It's a calculation known as a J-curve with regression analysis, and so I won't bore you with the details of what it takes, but it is acknowledging the increasing costs that occur on a smaller scale where there are smaller students but higher fixed costs in geographically distanced locations. This did go through analysis with the Commission on School Funding in this last biennium. They did make a recommendation to modify the definition for this. Currently, the recommendation was that if a school was 20 miles or more from another attendance area or more than a 30-minute drive, then they would qualify for this. We did run into some challenges that when we applied this, it resulted in quite a significant decrease for one of the districts in their per pupil amount. And so based on that, the recommendation was not included to modify that adjustment at this time. But this was in one of the adjustments that is still included, just the updated recommendation was not. The next adjustment is our Nevada cost of education adjustment. This accounts for the costs. It is comprised of two variables, a wage measure and a cost of goods measure. It analyzes what it takes to incentivize and recruit someone to an area that has a bachelor's degree, many of which is a requirement for our teachers, and then what in general it costs to purchase goods within that region. I like to equate this to a currency conversion. So if you were to go to another current country and you converted the US dollar to the equivalent in that country, that is similar to what this is doing. Within the governor's recommended model, the Commission on School Funding's recommendation to maintain this adjustment at 1 for everyone was maintained. The basis for this was because currently we're all very familiar with the fact that our funding is below the national average and has not reached optimal yet. So based on this, the Commission made the recommendation to continue monitoring and evaluating it, but until such a time that the model is funded appropriately, reducing if that were in fact the indicator for that district, reducing their per pupil amount as a result of this adjustment would only harm the already underfunded system. And so it was recommended to maintain 1.0 until such a time that optimal funding is achieved. That way we are not doubly reducing or impacting a district's allocations through the model. This table shows you the enrollment for fiscal year 26 with the statewide base, and then what the adjustment is as a result of the attendance area multiplier addition, and then Nevada cost of education. As you can see, based on the recommendation from the Commission, this was left at 1.0, so no adjustment. And then the combination of that for the adjusted base amount and then the per pupil amount as a result of the projected enrollment. And these are the values for fiscal year 26. And then the next slide are the values for fiscal year 27. Moving on to our fourth tier of funding. Once adjusted base funding has been pulled out of the waterfall, the residual funding is distributed across the tier 4, which is our weighted funding. We like to refer to this as our core plus more. In a framework of multi-tiered systems of support, the core would be adjusted base funding, and the plus more are supplemental for our additional students who need additional supports, tier 2 and tier 3 within MTSS framework. They receive funding through this level within the model. And this includes funding for our English learner students who are identified at risk of not graduating with their peers, and students who are identified as gifted and talented. For the students who qualify within these 3 different categories, you can see what the recommended multipliers are for the application. This is applied to the statewide base per pupil amount, not the adjusted base per pupil amount. And so if you are a student who is identified for English learner, your allocation would be the adjusted base per pupil amount plus 0.45% of the statewide base per pupil amount for approximately $18,000 additional to assist that student. Currently, the statute prescribes that students who are identified in multiple categories only receive funding for the highest weighted category. So if a student is identified to be all 3 of the categories, EL, at-risk, and gifted and talented, they would only receive the additional funding associated with the EL weight. However, they are expected to receive the services that they're entitled to for all 3 of those categories. And then on this slide, you can see, as I mentioned, what those allocations look like on a per pupil basis as applied to the statewide base. So the 9414 plus the 4200 would be what an EL student would receive. And then this slide shows you the counts of those students as they were identified from our October 2024 data poll. When these funds are distributed to school districts, they are based on a single count day from the prior school year. That amount is fixed for the year and distributed to the school districts and charter schools on a 1/12 apportionment. This is different from the adjusted base funding, which is distributed based on average daily enrollment accounts that are provided quarterly. And so the adjusted base funding can fluctuate from quarter to quarter based on the enrollment trends that the districts and charter schools are experiencing during the year. So there is a little bit of a difference in how those funds are distributed, but that is also to help provide stability in the weighted funding categories, because these programs require a more stable funding source. If the counts were to decrease over the year, that would mean the district or charter school would lose the funding. And so that's why we use the prior year count compared to the average quarterly report that's are received. And then on this table, you can see the based on the per pupil amounts from the earlier slide multiplied by the counts from the validation day. These would be the allocations for fiscal year 26. And then the next slide has the amounts for fiscal year 27. Because the per pupil amounts changed because they're based on that statewide base amount that increased in the second year, you do see a change in the allocations. But for the purposes of the budget, and because we don't have October 2025 counts yet, the counts have not changed, just the per pupil amounts. Those will be updated in the second year of the biennium once those counts become available. So taking all four of those tiers and summing them together, this slide shows you the allocations for fiscal year 26 across all of those different categories of funding. You can see that, as I mentioned, 3 of the school districts are still qualifying for the fiscal year 20 baseline funding. And so they receive, as I mentioned, the allocation on a per pupil amount based on fiscal year 2020 times their projected enrollment. They have the flexibility to distribute those funds across the other categories that are awarded to the other districts, but we don't designate specific amounts because they are awarded that flexibility through the provision in statute. And then this shows you the amounts for fiscal year 27 and what the calculated per pupil amount as a result of those allocations are. And with that, I will pause for questions before we go to the next budget account.
Thank you so much, Ms. Peterson. We will go ahead and start with Assemblymember Howdigate.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the presentation. A couple quick questions for me, and the first one's going to be, can you explain how the Governor's Finance Office calculated the general fund appropriations that are now recommended for the PCFP account for the next biennium?
Megan Peterson for the record. There are, yes, I'm sorry, let me restart. Megan Peterson for the record. It was a combined analysis based on enrollment and inflation, the CPI calculation, and then an analysis of the funding that was available.
Sorry, I was just a little confused. I was looking through my notes, and I thought I read that you guys didn't include an increase for inflation. That inflation was at 0.0%.
David Lenzler, Governor Finance Office for the record. We met the provisions under NRS 387.12455, Section 1B, which is the CPI and enrollment.
I have one more question? Okay. I have another question too regarding the Commission on School Funding's work regarding optimal funding. Can you give us an overview of the Commission on School Funding's work and recommendations related to providing optimal funding for K through 12 education? I specifically want information on what their recommendations were to achieve that optimal funding, because I know that the numbers were very high compared to what we were doing. So they also gave recommendations on how we can achieve higher numbers. So can you go into that a little bit, please?
Megan Peterson for the record. I will briefly touch on it. There's a 500-page report where they do detail out of the best approach to achieving that. But the commission did analyze and review areas of the economy of our tax-based structure that has historically not been modified over time. And this included recommended revisions to removing abatements or modifying abatements, depreciation schedules for property tax, additional taxes in areas of our sector, for example, that haven't historically been taxed. So this includes things like haircuts or massages, because we tend to be more of a service-based industry. These are areas that haven't been identified historically as being taxable. And so they did review and make recommendations in areas that include those, as well as several others.
And I just want to have a follow-up to that question. With respect to those other revenues that were suggested in the Commission on School Funding's plan, do you know if the governor this session has a plan or an anticipated bill that could start addressing these sources of revenue in order to try to get us aligned with those 10-year goals?
Tiffany Greenmeyer, Director for the Governor's Finance Office. I currently do not have that information in front of me, and it'd be my pleasure to get back with the fiscal staff and get you that information.
Thank you. That is appreciated. Next, we will go to Assemblymember Torres Fawcett.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation coming back to the committee. I had a couple questions about the statewide base per pupil funding amount. And I was wondering why the governor did not find it practicable to recommend the statewide base per pupil funding amount to increase by the combined rate of inflation and the growth of enrollment over this upcoming biennium.
David Lensner, Governor's Finance Office for the record. As we understand, the calculation for that increase would be an extra $240 million in general fund over the biennium. And the state simply just does not have that extra funding. So it was deemed impracticable.
And kind of a follow-up to that, what legislative changes are recommended by the governor to improve the methodology for determining public school funding pursuant to NRS 387-12455?
David Lensner, Governor's Finance Office for the record. We did submit a bill draft request for this purpose.
Let me go to Assemblymember Monroe Marino.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You stated that you submitted a bill draft. Could you let us know when that bill draft was submitted, and can you go into some details so everyone knows what's in that bill draft?
We submitted it last Friday, the deadline. I don't have the details. I don't have it in front of me. So we'll get back to you on that.
Can we get a general overview?
I'm sorry, I don't have it in front of me.
Okay, let me return back to Assemblymember Torres Fawcett.
Thank you. And can the committee just request that we get a copy of that as soon as possible? Because I remember during the pre-budget hearings that we actually had the same conversation, and that we were told by the governor's chief of staff that we would be receiving that information within a week or so. At this point, it's been over a month, and we haven't received any information or any details, and I don't believe any of my colleagues have met with them to get that information. So I do find it pertinent that we get that information as soon as possible. I don't think that it is difficult to get a hold of this committee, nor is it difficult to get a hold of individual lawmakers. Thank you.
Do you, GFO, do you have something you want to add, or you just coming up to take the place?
Tiffany Greenmeyer, Director for Governor's Finance Office. Yes, we did submit 2 budget BDRs to address the NRSs in the People-Centered Funding Plan. So you should have those shortly, and I can address it with the committee and give you a copy if you'd like. So the first budget amendment we addressed was the putting the teachers' raises in the auxiliary section of the bill, of the NRS.
So just to clarify that, Director, I take it that to maybe, so the one BDR that you're referencing, the details would be that the tier 1 would be expanded from just transportation services and food services to also include, I guess, the SB 231 from the 2023 type provisions.
Tiffany Greenmeyer, for the record, yes, that is correct.
And then, Ms. Director Greenmeyer, if you could also elaborate on that second BDR that I anticipate probably addresses this inflation issue.
Tiffany Greenmeyer, for the record, I don't have the second BDR, so I can only give you a really high level. We addressed a lot of those provisions in 353 that makes up the pupil-centered funding plan as it's funded. So and we can talk more about that. I can send you guys a copy if you'd like, so you have it.
That would be great. Thank you so much. If you could send that to our staff so it could be circulated, it would be really great. The sooner the better. We'd really appreciate it. Thank you. With that, I will go to Senator Scheibel.
Thank you. I'm hoping you can explain to us why the governor is not recommending the use of the Nevada Cost of Education Index in the 2025 to 2027 biennium.
Megan Peterson for the record. This was, as I mentioned, based on recommendations from the Commission on School Funding. Because the model currently has not reached optimal funding, in the event that a Nevada Cost of Education Index adjustment was less than 1, it would effectively reduce the allocation that is made to that school district. So as a result, that would have a compounding effect of a loss of funding in an already underfunded system.
And are there school districts that you've identified that would fall into that category?
Yes, there are only 2 districts, Clark and Washoe, who would not have a negative impact from the calculation as it currently stands. It is a calculation that is updated on a certain basis, and because of the way that the costs change, 1 year it could be a negative adjustment, less than 1.99, and in a different year it could be a positive adjustment, 0.10. It has some fluctuations that are not known until that calculation is updated, and given that impact, it's recommended not to be utilized at this time.
Okay, thank you. And what's the timeline for, you did kind of address this, but what's the timeline for implementation of that adjustment for this people-centered funding plan?
Megan Peterson for the record. The commission has recommended analyzing that until such a time that the model is optimally funded, at which point I believe they would anticipate recommending applying the adjustment.
Thank you so much. We'll go back to Assemblymember Torres Fawcett.
Thank you, Chair. Can you discuss the rationale for projecting the flat enrollment each year of the 26-27 biennium?
Megan Peterson for the record. As we've been tracking enrollment over the last few years, we've been tracking it for a long time, but the trends that we have seen within the last few years seem to indicate relatively flat enrollment. And so if we projected increasing enrollment, that would potentially reduce the overall per pupil amount available. So maintaining the current levels was identified to be the best course of action.
Thank you. And what has the department attributed those trends to?
Megan Peterson for the record. We've seen a variety of impacts within the last 4 years. A large portion seemed, at least most immediately, to be related to the pandemic and parents keeping their children at home and opting instead for homeschooling. Also, when the pandemic hit, our state experienced a large decline in enrollment, most likely because people left our state due to job loss. And so we have seen that stabilize over the last couple of years, but at least initially it seemed to be resulting from implications from the pandemic.
Thank you. And I believe homeschool parents are required to submit some type of form to the department as well. Have we seen an increase of those forms being collected as well to track that?
Megan Peterson for the record, those are actually reported to the school districts. We have been reaching out to try and understand what they've been seeing and experiencing, but I don't have that with me today.
Thank you. Next, we will go to Assemblymember Monroe Marino.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to discuss the FY 2020 baseline funding and the methodology changes that were made. I have a few questions, if that's okay, Madam Chair. Thank you. Okay, first one, what was the rationale from shifting the cost from auxiliary, local special education, and weighted funding categories to the adjusted base per pupil amount for the FY 2020 baseline school districts?
I'm sorry, Megan Peterson, can you repeat that question?
Sure. So what was the rationale behind shifting the cost from the auxiliary, the local special education, and weighted funding categories to the adjusted base per pupil amount for the FY 2020 baseline school districts?
Megan Peterson for the record. When the fiscal year 2020 baseline amount is calculated for the school districts, it is based on the total funding that was allocated to that district at that point in time. So that included effectively what translates to all tiers of funding within the pupil-centered funding plan, and then was put on a per pupil amount. So all tiers of the funding that are represented for the districts who are funded through the pupil-centered funding plan are reflected in that single per pupil amount. And so if you are adding and accounting for those after that per pupil amount, you've duplicated those adjustments.
So in that, was it, or how was it studied of how these changes would impact before it was included in the governor's recommended budget?
Megan Peterson for the record. Yes, that's how we identified what had transpired, and based on the intent of the law, we updated the calculation to align with that intent.
Okay, so how, if you say there was a study done, how was it studied, what this impact would be before it was added?
I analyzed the calculations and did a comparison.
And then we do have the Commission on School Funding. What input, if any, did they provide before these changes were made?
Megan Peterson for the record. The Commission on School Funding has not historically been involved in the budget build process, nor the individual mechanics of how some of those applications are applied.
The school districts themselves will be impacted. What was the communications with the school districts about this change?
Megan Peterson for the record. Once the final governor recommended budget has become available, we do meet with the school districts and go over the impacts of the proposed changes within the plan. Pending today's presentation, we are going to be meeting with all school districts to share that information like we have in the past.
Thank you for that. So you wait to meet with them after this meeting, or you've met with them, already had some conversation, we'll have an additional conversation after this meeting?
Megan Peterson, for the record, it will be after this meeting. We have these meetings with the school districts once the presentation has been made, and that way we have all feedback that we can take to them at that time.
And then, Madam Chair, can I go on to the funding model, the balancing adjustment and the changes there? Perfect. Thank you.
I'll go to Assemblymember Dondero Loop.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be back in the assembly. All right, I have a couple of questions as well. Why is it being recommended that the fiscal year 2020 baseline school districts are excluded from receiving a proportional balancing adjustment to their adjusted base per pupil amount, similar to the other school districts, charter schools, and university schools?
Megan Peterson, for the record. As I mentioned, when the per pupil fiscal year 2020 baseline amount is calculated for the school districts that qualify, it is inclusive of all of the tiers of funding. And based on our understanding of the intent, they are not to receive less than the fiscal year 2020 amount. So if we were to reduce that, we believed that was in conflict with the intent of the statute.
Okay, so then with that being said, how was the impact of this change studied before being included in the governor's recommended budget?
Megan Peterson, for the record. As I mentioned, that was part of the budget build process and the analysis of comparing the models and the outcomes. So it was part of the review of the model while we were validating the mechanisms.
I'm sorry, would you repeat that?
Megan Peterson, for the record. Yes, so it's part of the budget build process that we use as we update the model for the agency request and governor recommended stages of the budget build.
So as you built that budget, you took an effect that this would change, the impact of this would happen. Is that what I'm understanding you to say?
That is correct.
Okay. And then what input, again, if any, did the Commission on School Funding provide in this change?
Megan Peterson, for the record, they did not. As I mentioned, as part of the budget build process, the Commission on School Funding is not historically involved in the mechanics of building the model.
So I guess I'm questioning that. Like, we have this Commission on School Funding. We have these expert people who are involved in funding of school districts and in the state. And we're not asking them for any of their input of what they've studied. Why is that?
Megan Peterson, for the record. As with all of the adjustments and part of the budget build process, that stage of it is confidential, as you may know. And there are other adjustments that are made, such as the addition of the additional funding for the salary adjustments and transportation in the auxiliary tiers of funding. Those were not addressed with the commission either as part of the budget build process.
Okay, that just confuses me that we have this commission that is doing this studying, and I understand you saying that there is confidentiality, but we have entrusted this commission being selected to study this and give us the expert opinions that they have as financial people, and then we're not using it. So it's a little confusing to me as why we wouldn't do that. All right, thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And then I apologize to Senator
it's
Don
okay.
Darrow for referring to her as assembly member.
I'm happy to be on your team.
Okay.
That's exactly right.
So I have a question. Why is the governor recommending online schools within the school districts receiving FY 2020 baseline funding services receive the adjusted base per pupil amount as opposed to the statewide per pupil amount for its pupils attending the online schools?
Megan Peterson for the record. This was based on a recommendation from the Commission on School Funding. When they reviewed the impact that that would have, the statewide base per pupil amount typically is lower than their fiscal year 2020 baseline funding amount. And as in alignment with the other changes that were made, this would be in conflict with the intent of the fiscal year 2020 baseline funding. And so it was recommended not to be changed.
And then if I may, I kind of just wanted to circle back because I get that on this recommendation, this kind of came from the Commission on School Funding. But when we look at like other aspects such as the funding model balancing adjustment, was there a reason why the department relied on the Commission on School Funding's recommendation in this area, but in other areas provided that you've kind of testified today that you haven't consulted them or like relied on that for the other areas?
Megan Peterson for the record. In part, the commission was specifically tasked with looking at the impacts of moving schools, online schools, to a statewide amount instead of the fiscal year 2020 baseline. In other situations, it was the result of working through the model in the budget build process and identifying those gaps, and then making a determination based on what we understand the intent to be to align those activities.
Thank you. I appreciate that follow-up. Next, I will go to Speaker Yeager.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the presentation. I have a few questions about the at-risk calculation. And I guess just as a preface, I was kind of taking a look, and it looks like enrollment projections are slated to increase for English language learner and gifted and talented, but I see that at-risk pupils are projected to decrease by a little over 13,000 pupils, which is about 21%. And I think the idea there was, you can't be counted in multiple weights, basically. But here was sort of the question. It looks to me like the English learner pupils from 2025 to this biennium are going to increase by about 2,200 plus. But the decrease to at-risk is about 13,000. So I'm just kind of wondering what accounts for that gap there, if those at-risk pupils are not all being moved to the other weights. What happened to those additional approximately 11,000 that are no longer going to be in that category?
Megan Peterson for the record. We have been studying and analyzing this, and when you look at the unduplicated counts, there was actually an increase in the overall count of students identified in the at-risk category. We went from approximately 92,000 students identified to 95,000 students identified. And so what you're seeing in that reduction at the at-risk level is actually an increase in both the count of students identified as receiving IEPs and EL.
And perhaps you can just clarify, I'm trying to wrap my head around this. If there is an increase to the number of at-risk, why would essentially there be a 21% decrease from the number of students who are receiving that funding? I might just be missing something. It is Wednesday, it is math, but if you could help me understand that a little bit more. It seems like we would have more at-risk students if the count is actually increasing.
Megan Peterson, and I'm sorry, I'm also trying to get through my brain fog a little bit. That is because we actually saw a pretty significant increase in the number of students who are in the higher weighted categories, so special education and EL. We can see almost a direct correlation in the increase of the special education students who would then come out of that count, and then our EL students who came out of that count as well.
Thank you. And if I could, Chair, I just wanted to clarify. I think I understand what you're saying. I mean, I saw that there's an increase in English language learners, but you're saying there's also increases in special education, and we think so. I mean, do we think that that accounts for, I mean, what is essentially a decrease of 13,000 who are getting the at-risk? That all of those are essentially in another category, and that's why they're not in the at-risk category this time around.
Megan Peterson, that is correct.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. And Chair, if I could ask just a couple more on the at-risk. I wanted to ask, I know the Commission on School Funding looked at this, but can you just discuss the rationale for continuing to utilize the grad score within the Infinite Campus system to identify at-risk pupils?
Megan Peterson for the record. Yes, the Commission on School Funding and the State Board of Education have actually spent a considerable amount of time on this topic, and we have been analyzing and reviewing alternative options. At this point in time, the Commission is recommending to continue utilizing that metric and to study and analyze it while identifying if there are other alternatives. To this point, this has been the most comprehensive indicator that has been identified to address multiple areas of a student's matrix in an attempt to best assist them with meeting their needs to be successful. When we look at other indicators such as free and reduced price lunch or direct cert, they are a single indicator. And oftentimes we are not able to necessarily identify students who or parents who are not advocating for their students. And so within the grad score itself, whether you are identified or not, your parent is actively engaged or not, you do receive a score, and the system does provide you the ability and access to look at those students and individually identify what it is that would have the most impact on the success of that student. And so based on that information, it's recommended to continue using it at this point in time until such a metric could be determined that could provide as robust of support as possible.
Great, thank you. And Chair, one last question on this, if I may. I did note that the Commission on School Funding, I think, is going to continue to look at this and provide recommendations. So I'm anxious to see, if that changes at some point. I did note when they looked at this the last time, I think they had some issue with the moniker at-risk pupils, and were recommending some kind of a change to call it a student success support, or just something that was different in terms of terminology. So my question there for anybody who knows, do we believe the governor is going to be recommending any legislation to address that particular recommendation from the Commission on School Funding regarding at least the changes to what the weight is called in the funding formula?
Tiffany Greenmeyer for the record. I'll have to look into that. I can't recall offhand if that recommendation came through, but I'll get back to you.
No, thanks. I appreciate that. It does look like there was some concern there, and I think that would require a legislative change because I think the weights are specified in statute. So when you have that answer, just would appreciate knowing that. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
And I actually just have a couple questions for you guys regarding the salary increases distribution methodology. With the distribution of the salary adjustment fund for school districts align with the distribution methodology of Senate Bill 231 from the 2023 session. And I know you guys have a bill, but kind of just with respect to the calculation that's proposed in Tier 1.
Megan Peterson for the record. That was why the model was built with adding that level of funding to Tier 1. It ensures that the dollars can be transferred back to the districts based on the subgrant agreements that we have in place once a district had received approval from the Interim Finance Committee. So the amounts were built into the model based on how they were allocated and approved for.
And just to understand that, because not all school districts took 100% of the potential allocations under SB 231 formula. So did you use the SB 231 formula or just based on the subgrants that ultimately were awarded via IFC?
Megan Peterson for the record. It was based on what was ultimately approved by the IFC.
I appreciate that clarification. I have another question too. What is the Department of Education or the Governor's Finance Office's plan to conduct research or survey charter schools to determine if the count of their teachers and education support professionals warrant salary adjustment funding comparable to the Washoe County School District?
Megan Peterson for the record. The department is currently working with the State Public Charter School Authority to analyze and come up with a methodology that would align with the intent of the dollars while honoring the funding that is available.
Thank you for that. Next, I will turn to Majority Leader Canizero.
Okay, I think I have a few questions. Okay. I hope you can hear me. I think some of our mics are a little soft, but I can speak up, so you'll hopefully be able to hear me. I guess your answer to my colleague's question has sort of prompted another question for me. Because if I heard that answer correctly, it's that you're sort of looking into how you would distribute that based upon the dollars that are available. But do you have any like parameters on, are you doing this for every teacher, for every support staff? Is the intent to provide it for teachers and support staff in the charter schools? Have you determined which schools sort of fall within that? Are you doing this based on teachers that are licensed? I guess, do you have any idea about that other than you're trying to figure out how to meet intent with the space of the dollars available?
Megan Peterson for the record. We're still working through what all of those details look like. In part, we are waiting for the language to come out on what the expectations were around it, but it is broad. And so that is why we are looking at all options. It's a new experience for us that we are trying to navigate.
I guess that's concerning when we have an amount that has been allocated for the charter schools for these raises that is part of this budget presentation, but no parameters around how those dollars are being distributed or allocated to the schools, whether it includes teachers and staff or any sort of indication on that. I'm struggling a bit with some of the information that we're receiving this morning because there doesn't seem to be a lot of clarity, and I'm not sure if that's just an unwillingness to share that clarity at this point in time, or if we're just not sure and we're at this point in reviewing budgets and we're just not sure. So that's a little concerning because we have an amount here that you're asking for in terms of raises to include charter schools, which I think is a laudable discussion. But how it is that you're allocating those dollars, and there doesn't seem to be any indication of what those considerations are or how you arrived at that amount.
Tiffany Greenmeyer for the record. So the amount was a comparable amount to Washoe. And that's how they got to the $19 million a year. But as to the parameters, as how it's going to be allocated, I will have to get back to you on that, and we can discuss it.
Right, and I think that that's why I had a follow-up question, and I thank you, Madam Chair, for the leniency, because I do have a few other questions. Her question was, we're just saying this is about the same size as Washoe, so therefore it should be about the same amount of money, but without any further detail or any sort of indication on how you arrived at that number. So that's difficult. I hope that we will get some information because I was sort of expecting that at this budget hearing where we're talking about this, there would be information to give us on that. There are a couple of other items here, and I guess just on some of the answers that we've heard today. There are times where, for example, when we were doing the cost indexing piece, the answer was that the Commission on School Funding had not recommended that, and so therefore that was not included. Then there were other questions by various colleagues about, did you talk to the Commission on School Funding as it relates to some of these other funding pieces? And it was, well, we're not working with the Commission on School Funding on that because we don't believe that that's something that we really needed to talk to them about. So how are you making these different differentiations between what it is you're going to say, well, the Commission on School Funding said this, so that's why we're going to incorporate that, versus, well, we're just not going to talk to the Commission on School Funding or some of their recommendations we're not going to consider. How are you making those distinctions? How is the governor's office making the distinctions of when they're going to follow the Commission on School Funding's recommendations and when they are not going to follow the Commission on School Funding's recommendations?
Megan Peterson for the record. When we go through the budget build process where there is scope specifically identified within the Commission on School Funding's purview, their recommendations are considered and incorporated, and there are areas within the budget build process that do not fall within the scope of the Commission on School Funding, and so that is when frequently they have not been involved in the budget build process.
And I think that the questions from some of my colleagues, for example, Senator Scheibel asked about the cost indexing piece that was, well, the Commission on School Funding made that recommendation, so therefore that's what we're sticking with, which is fine. Then there were questions from my colleague, from the speaker, that talked about some of the other pieces of Commission on School Funding or some of these other funding mechanisms from some of my other colleagues. And it was, well, we're not considering that because we didn't believe that they should weigh in on those pieces. I struggle a little bit with that because while I'm not saying bring them in and do budget build with them, there are times where you're looking at what the work that has been assigned to the Commission on School Funding is asked to do. Certainly, you could have made the same decision and said, well, we're not going to go with the cost allocation piece that the Commission on School Funding is recommending, but you did. And so it's a little tough, I think, when we're trying to ask questions about some of these recommendations from a body that we have tasked with looking into these things and making those sorts of recommendations so we can bring them to the legislature so that they can be a part of this budget conversation, that we're sort of picking and choosing when it is that's appropriate and when it's not. So thank you, Madam Chair. I have some questions, if I may, on some of the salary pieces. Can you talk to us about why the salary adjustment funds are being recommended as a tier within the pupil-centered funding plan, as opposed to a categorical program within the department's other state education programs budget account?
Tiffany Greenmeyer for the record. So the decision to keep it into a tier was to make sure all school districts are equitable. And that's the reason why it was not put into the formula. Because not all schools, if you ran it through the formula, there would be winners and losers on receiving those dollars.
Sure, because when it runs through the formula, then you're basing it on your per pupil. When those funds were allocated based upon the number of staff and teachers that are reside within each of those schools, and then a pro rata distribution based upon the available funds. And that's how IFC sort of came to that calculation, why we wanted that information from the school districts. What we're seeing in the governor's recommended budget is that is now placed, though, still within the tier for the pupil-centered funding plan. So there are other parameters that now will apply to that with respect to how the pupil-centered funding plan adjusts with revenue and inflation and so on and so forth, as opposed to keeping it as a categorical in those other educational expenses. So what was the rationale between, because I'm not talking about putting it into the formula, I'm talking about whether or not you would keep it as a separate categorical versus keep it in the tier within the pupil-centered funding plan.
Megan Peterson for the record. So with the implementation of the pupil-centered funding plan, the intent was to streamline and reduce the number of categorical funds that we have available. So in honoring that and keeping it aligned with the population of students that are being served, it seemed most appropriate to keep it within the pupil-centered funding plan. When we start adding these funds back to other budget accounts and categorical funds, we start to end up in that situation where what part of the funding should be calculated as part of the total per pupil that the state is spending and which isn't. So based on all the efforts that we just went through to try and standardize and combine that funding, it didn't seem pertinent to put that into another categorical set of funding.
And so, if this program is approved within the pupil-centered funding plan, how would that impact other categories of funding during economic downturns?
Megan Peterson, for the record, that's partially why it was recommended to be put into this tier. So just like with the transportation and the local special education funding, this would be the first set of funds to come off and would be ensured to maintain the same level of funding before reducing any of the funding downstream.
I want to talk a little bit, I have one more question, if I may, Madam Chair, on the statewide per pupil change and the salary adjustment scenario that we're talking about here. Why is the governor and NDE recommending distributing the funds as a tier through the pupil-centered funding plan formula as opposed to other methodologies?
Megan Peterson, for the record. And so I think we've touched on this a little bit today, but given the fact that those were dollars that were negotiated with labor unions and are tied to contracts, maintaining that funding so that way the districts could honor it, it seemed most appropriate to keep it in this tier of funding.
I think that's all the questions I have for right now. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Sounds good. Next, I will go to Speaker Yeager.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a few questions on charter school transportation, but before I get there, I neglected to ask one final question on the at-risk. So if I could go back to that for a second. I was looking at NRS 387.1211, which defines at-risk, and it defines it as those who are within the quintile of pupils, which I think is 20%. It's not a word I use that often, but I did notice that the Commission on School Funding did recommend removing that quintile provision from statute in favor of a threshold that would be revised every biennium by the State Board of Education. So essentially to remove that sort of 20% cap in NRS, and I just wondered if really, I guess the question is whether we believe the governor is going to bring legislation to do that based on the recommendations of the Commission on School Funding, or if you have any other light you can shed on that. I don't think they were recommending to expand the 20% right now because we don't have the revenue, but it looks like they wanted to take it out of statute to have more flexibility.
Megan Peterson, for the record. So I believe that that is still part of ongoing conversations in terms of budget implementation, but I did want to clarify, it is the percentile of performance that students are identified to fall into. And so when the recommendation was initially put in place to move to this metric, that was a starting point for analysis. And so that's why the commission was wanting to update that, was so that if it was in turn determined that we had a larger net that we needed to cast to capture the students appropriately, that would be available to be adjusted as need to meet the needs of the students.
Thank you. And then, Chair, if I could ask a few on charter school transportation. I wanted to ask this last biennium, or I guess the last interim, 23-24, if you could talk a bit about the kind of charter school transportation costs that were reimbursed under the money that we allocated from the last biennium.
Megan Peterson for the record. So as I've understood it in working with the State Public Charter School Authority, and if we need, I have additional support for more clarification in the audience, but initially for many of those schools, this was a startup opportunity for them. So many of the things that they purchased were things like vehicles and the registration for those to operate them. And it did take a little bit of time to get that up and running for the first year. As I understand it, some had challenges registering and things like that. But as that has gone on, I believe almost all of the funds have been obligated for fiscal year 25 at this point. But at this point in time, for many of them, it is the startup costs of procuring the equipment and the staff and the supports to run those programs.
Great, thank you. And Chair, just a couple more if I might. I noticed in this budget recommendation, it includes $8 million in fiscal year 2026 and $9 million in fiscal year 2027. And could you just talk about how those numbers were determined and whether that would be sufficient to provide equitable funding for charter school transportation costs? And if you need to phone a friend, that's all right as well.
We'd be happy to invite up the State Public Charter School Authorities Director.
Thank you, Chair.
Melissa Macadin for the record. So this fiscal year, we have 27 schools offering transportation. In order to equitably fund those schools, we would need $9 million each year of the biennium. The important thing to note about that is that does not allow any additional schools to add transportation. So we have 5 new schools that are opening next school year, and they are hopeful to be able to apply to offer transportation. But the way to fund them equitably, this would not be enough. There's other ways we could do it outside of the amount that is awarded in each district for transportation funding, and we're working through that with the Nevada Department of Education.
Great, thank you, Chair. And while you're there, I have one follow-up to that, and I think it probably dovetails nicely with what you just said. So my question was going to be I think our note said 8 million and then 9 million. I think you said 9 million, but we'll call it 9, I guess. But how you were intending to distribute that amount among the charter schools in the upcoming biennium, and it sounds like, you can correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like you were going to sort of make sure that those who already have transportation programs would be able to maintain that funding. Could you, I guess, just confirm that again for the record, or whether there's going to be some other methodology to look at distributing that money?
Melissa Macadin for the record. Thank you for that question. Yeah, how we funded it the last biennium was on a grant, an application. Of course, we would love to have it, flow through the auxiliary funding the same way, but since it doesn't look like there's going to be enough funds to do that, we would probably do something very similar where it's a competitive grant basis.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much. I just had a follow-up because one of the things you said is right now you have the 27 schools that could be continued, but one of the big expenses that I kind of noticed, especially in fiscal year 24, over half of the funds actually distributed included the purchase of vehicle and equipment. So I anticipate that the schools that are already utilizing the grants wouldn't need those capital expenditures. So does that then free up funds for the new schools? How does that involve in the equation of when you're granting funds to the various charter schools to ensure that's equitable amongst all of them?
Melissa Macadin for the record. That's a great question. Certainly that is somewhat true, but also what is also true is most of these charter schools started off on a very small scale, like one vehicle, two bus stops, right? And they really weren't touching a massive amount of students. So I think each of these schools that's operating, they're hoping to kind of grow their operation. They started off small. They want to see that grow. Now, obviously, you know, we have to be cognizant of these new schools that are coming on, and that is why, if the funding's not available, we'll more than likely continue to do it through like a grant application.
Thank you. I don't think we have any other questions on that topic. Oh, let me go to Assembly Member Torres Fawcett.
Thank you. And these questions are regarding transportation, but I don't know that they're necessarily for the SPCSA. So I'm wondering how it was determined that the $17 million in general fund appropriations would be removed from the pupil-centered funding plan budget account and instead provided as a one-time general fund appropriation.
Megan Peterson for the record. My understanding is that as the budget office has been working through the reconciliation of the budget, given the ongoing obligations of including it not as one-time funding, exceeded the authority available, and so therefore it was recommended to be moved to one-time funding for this biennium.
Tiffany Greenmeyer for the record. It was recommended to continue it as one-time funding through this biennium too. Because there was one-time funding in this biennium. So we're just continuing that on.
Okay, I'm not going to ask any follow-ups on that specific topic, but what is the governor's long-term plan for funding the transportation costs for charter schools? Because obviously it should be a part of the budget instead of constantly coming back to the legislature and asking for one-time fund appropriations.
Tiffany Greenmeyer for the record. You know, if we go into the next biennium, you know, as funding is available, then it'll be put in as ongoing if it's available. If it's not available, then we'll do the same thing and put it in as a one-time. So it all depends on the economic forums bringing in the revenues, right, and what's projected. So if there's not enough ongoing revenue to cover it, we're going to have to put it in one time.
Along those lines, I actually have a follow-up because one of the questions I had asked earlier today, and since we have you up here, Director, regarding the BDRs that were submitted. Earlier, I had inquired about the Commission on School Funding's recommendations to look at those revenue enhancements, to look at a 10-year projection of what could be done so that we could reach some sort of, I think the word used today, optimal funding for our public education. In those two BDRs, did that address any of the Commission on School Funding's recommendations to take a deep dive at the revenue sources?
Tiffany Greenmeyer for the record. No, that's not in the BDR that I submitted, but it can be considered.
Thank you so much. With that, members, do we have any further questions on budget account 2032609? We do have some overlap when you go into the other budget items, so if we do, we'll go ahead and let that happen. So with that, I assume, Ms. Peterson, you're going to be doing the presentation on budget account 2032608 on the education stabilization account, or someone else. Feel free to start when you're ready.
Megan Peterson for the record. Moving on to the Education Stabilization Account, budget account 2608. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, this is the account that has been established effectively as the rainy day account for the pupil-centered funding plan. As I mentioned, there are two mechanisms that I addressed earlier in terms of how this account can be funded, there is a third option. So as a quick overview and reminder, in the event that revenues are received at a higher rate than initially projected through the legislatively approved budget, any unexpended funds resulting from that would transfer to this account. And conversely, if enrollment did not materialize at the level that was projected and was less than that, any of the unexpended funds as a result of that would also transfer to this account. As a third option, when school district end fund balances at the end of the year are calculated to exceed 16.6% of their authorized budget, then any amount that exceeds that would also transfer to this account. There is a grandfather clause that raises that 16.6% based on what it was when the implementation of the People-Centered Funding Plan began. But as that reduces over time, it resets that threshold, and at which point they would any excess would then transfer to this account. And then at such a time when this account exceeds 20% of the legislatively approved amount for the People-Centered Funding Plan, those funds would transfer at the end of the year to become available in the next biennium to assist in increasing the per pupil amount available through the People-Centered Funding Plan. Based on the mechanisms of this account, there were no enhancements included except for to account for interest earned. And you can see those projected amounts on this slide for fiscal year 26 and 27. Currently, this fund is sitting at about approximately 15.5% of the fiscal year 25 appropriations. So we're still a little bit a ways from that 20%. We're not projecting it to change much for fiscal year 26 and 27 at this time. And I will pause for questions.
Thank you so much. We will start with Assemblymember Howdegi.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. And I want to talk about the cash flow between the two. When does the Nevada Department of Education anticipate requesting IFC approval for the permanent transfer from the Education Stabilization Account to the PCFP in fiscal year 2025 due to the revenue being less than projected?
Megan Peterson for the record. So we are continuing to monitor and track that. Unfortunately, until the fiscal year closes and we know what the final revenues are, we're not able to provide an accurate number, but we will be working with the Fiscal Analysis Division to provide updates and projections as we get closer to that.
Okay, and if I could, Madam Chair, follow up? Okay, and have you guys thought about the ramifications if the Education Stabilization Account balance becomes too low to adequately provide cash flow assistance to the PCFP?
Megan Peterson for the record. Yes, we've been in conversations with Fiscal Analysis Division staff, the Governor's Finance Office, and the Treasurer's Office as well to try and identify options to mitigate those challenges.
Have you guys identified any? Like, have you guys come up with any solutions?
We're working through some solutions. I don't have specific details because there are a number of variables that we're still working to validate, but we are looking into different options that may be available.
If I could have one follow-up? Okay. Did the Commission on School Funding have any recommendations for this part? Like in case the Education Stabilization Account becomes too low?
Megan Peterson for the record. This was not a topic that had been identified to discuss during this biennium, given the timing and the capacity of all of the other topics that we had to cover, and based on the timing of how the cash flow has been falling out. The commission was required to conclude their activities in December, and this was a more pertinent conversation that came up starting in January. So they were not in session when we began these conversations.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I mean, obviously, we would be very interested in it due to the last session, us providing that ESA as kind of a way to assist when the timing of the revenues come in. And it looks like we are going to be in a situation, especially for fiscal year 25, where we're going to be, the ESA account's going to be a lot lower to cover those. So whatever you guys find out, we would love to be looped into that, especially our staff, so that we may be able to account for that as we're closing these budgets and addressing issues going forward. Does anyone else have any questions for Ms. Peterson or her team regarding the ESA budget? Okay, it doesn't look like it. So we'll go ahead and move on to budget account 101-2619, NDE's account for state special education services.
Megan Peterson for the record. Budget count 2619, as I mentioned earlier, is a second set of funding that is available for our state special education. As I mentioned, there was federal special education provided. These are done through what's known as IDEA or individual, it's the special, the IDEA Part B funds for our students. And then we have a state portion that is provided through this budget account in addition to the funding that is provided locally as a transfer from adjusted base funding for districts. So within this budget account, we also have what's called the contingency account. These are funds that are set aside for districts or charter schools who receive a student who has higher costs than normal that they're able to absorb within their budget, and they have the ability to come to the Interim Finance Committee to ask for supplemental funding. By statute, this account is required to maintain a $2 million balance, and so you can see that reflected as part of the governor's recommended budget in the second table on this slide. And then within this account, we also have the main portion of the state special education funding in category 19. This provides funding for special education services for students who have individualized education plans up to 13% of the district or the LEA's total population of funds. Given the requirements from the federal level to maintain this level of funding, regardless of the economic situation of the state, this was recommended to have a 2% COLA adjustment, in addition to the same level of funding from the prior year, for a total of $256 million in fiscal year 26 and $260 million in fiscal year 27. We'll pause for questions.
Thank you so much for that presentation for this budget account. I will go ahead and start with Assembly Member Monroe Marino.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Looking at our backup notes here, it looks like pupils with disabilities at Clark County School District and the charter schools sponsored by the state would receive a lower weight than which may otherwise they would have been eligible for with this calculation of the state funding distribution methodology for state special education program. So what are the ramifications for providing the CCSD and the charter schools that are sponsored by the State Public Charter School Authority funding for state special education with a state multiplier that's less than the English learner weight of the 0.45?
Megan Peterson, when we do that analysis, we're not analyzing it at the individual district or LEA level. It is in total for that pot of funding. So while an individual LEA may have a lower effective calculated multiplier, because in total the multiplier for that entire pot of funding exceeds those weighted categories within the pupil-centered funding plan, the students still receive that higher weight. Additionally, because of the federal requirement for students to receive that funding, they are identified for the state special education funding, regardless of what the weight would be in comparison to those identified within the pupil-centered funding plan.
So those special education students in CCSD aren't receiving a lower amount than at other school districts?
Megan Peterson for the record. So to back up a little bit more on the total methodology, in 2015, the state transitioned from a teacher allocation methodology to a pupil methodology within special education. And similar to the hold harmless or the fiscal year 2020 baseline provision in the pupil-centered funding plan, in order to transition to that allocation methodology, there was a hold harmless policy put in place with the special education funding. And so when you do the individual calculation within those districts, from year to year, that effective multiplier that's calculated off of that varies, and in some cases can be less than a sister LEA. Over time, the intent was for those dollars to normalize and for everyone to meet the target multiplier for that category. However, enrollment within the LEAs increases and fluctuates at different rates, which in some cases can delay the amount of time of coming back to that standard 0.46 as it is currently. In the previous session, we had, in previous years, we've had 6 or 7 LEAs who have been in that situation where their effective per pupil amount is less than some of the other districts, but over time that has reduced and we're now down to only 2, the SPCSA and Clark County, who are receiving a lower amount. But as time goes on, that is normalizing.
Thank you. Madam Chair, may I ask another question? So, the governor is recommending a general fund appropriation of just over 287 million over the biennium for a salary adjustment tier within the pupil-centered funding plan. Is the recommendation to continue the 2% roll-up duplicative of the funding for salary increases?
Tiffany Greenmeyer for the record. I don't have the exact answer for that. I'd like to get back to you on that so it's clear. I don't want to give you incorrect information.
I would appreciate that. And then also, could you let us know why the funding for that 2% roll-up continued to be budgeted, since the state we've largely moved to a revenue-based model for providing K-12 education funding? So when you get back to us on that, will you get back to us on both?
Tiffany Greenmeyer for the record, yes.
Perfect. And then, Madam Chair, just going back to the Commission on School Funding again, could you let us know why the funding for the Commission on Schools funding recommendations to transition from the funding of the state special education program to a phased-in per pupil distribution methodology was not included in the executive budget? And I know you've talked about they're not part of the budget process, but you've also talked about you use some of their recommendations in other parts of it, so.
Megan Peterson for the record. We can follow up with you when we respond with those other questions regarding that clarification.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Next, we will go to Senator Dondero Loop.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. So, sort of following that, given that the Department of Ed has effectively been increasing that state special education program funding each fiscal year by the 1.5 million, and they're providing that 13% categorical funding on the ongoing basis to school districts, why didn't they request this changed in prior budgets?
Megan Peterson for the record. To make sure I understand your question, you're asking why the 1.5 million wasn't included as an enhancement in the base funding in prior years?
Right. Why did it not request? Why did the department not request this funding? This change in prior budgets.
Megan Peterson for the record. That was a learning opportunity for our staff. When they took over the budget account, the policy implementation there was not clear. And historically, those funds had been included in the amounts, or it was understood that they were included in the amounts that were legislatively appropriated. And so it was a gap in understanding of the budget policy.
So with that being said, does the 1.5 million per year allocation provide enough funding then to sufficiently address the provision of NRS 387.122, which indicates that if the number of enrolled pupils with disabilities exceed 13% of total pupils, an apportionment shall be made to the school districts and charter schools equaling 1/2 of the statewide multiplier for pupils with disabilities? Or will the superintendent of public instruction need to proportionately reduce the amounts apportioned to each school district and charter school?
Megan Peterson for the record. So there are two mechanisms in play when that $1.5 million is made available each year for the students who exceed the 13% cap. That represents an ongoing obligation for those school districts and charter schools who receive those funds. So that is where the mechanism and the gap in budget policy of adding that as a separate enhancement into the base funding each year to maintain that level of funding for LEAs was previously missed. That is included in the governor's recommended budget before you today. For the second portion, that is a new calculation done each year because the percent of pupils within each LEA that's eligible for that additional funding changes each year. That pot of funding was not recommended to be renewed for this upcoming biennium.
Okay, so just to clarify, it was not suggested or recommended that this be continued.
Megan Peterson for the record. For this upcoming biennium, it was not recommended to be funded.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much. Next, we will go to Senator Canizero.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you talk just a little bit about why the 13% limitation in statute is not recommended to also be eliminated with the elimination of that 13% supplemental funding?
Tiffany Greenmeyer for the record. When the original governor's recommended budget was being built, that was considered as a cost saving, so that's my understanding is that's why it wasn't put in the budget.
Yes, the supplemental funding was not included. However, why is that limitation, that 13% limitation in statute, not also recommended to be eliminated?
Tiffany Greenmeyer for the record. I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. So if that was the case, I would have removed it, sent a budget BDR and removed it.
So is there a plan? Is there a plan to do that, or now because there's been some change with the budget amendment, that is no longer the case? We're not pursuing that.
I'd like to give you Tiffany Greenmeyer for the record. I'd like to give you a clear answer on that. And so if you don't mind, I can get back to you on that so we can have a full understanding if we need to submit something to remove that 13% or not.
Okay. Yes, I think getting some clear information on that would be very helpful. Potentially this next question probably falls in that same category of some information that we're going to expect to get after this hearing. So why is subsection 2 of NRS 387.122 that requires some state funding for special education pupils who exceed the 13% funding cap not being recommended for elimination? And maybe that falls in the same situation of us getting some additional information and a clear answer following this hearing.
Tiffany Greenmeyer for the record. Yes, I'm going to have to follow up and do some research on that, and so I can come back with a very clear answer for you.
And at risk of adding another thing to that set, I guess, can you tell us at all how this recommendation was studied or considered by the Commission on School Funding?
Megan Peterson for the record. The Commission on School Funding scope lies within the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan, which pertains to the 4 tiers that I had mentioned earlier. Special education funding has not historically been identified in that umbrella, with the exception of the legislative letter of intent that was provided from the last session.
Okay. We will look forward to getting additional information on some of these answers. Thank you, Madam Chair, for the second round.
No, absolutely. And then I have a follow-up along these lines because I believe in response to Speaker Yeager's inquiries about the at-risk number decreasing by about 13,000. I think about 3,000 of those students got reallocated, whether it may be to the ELL, but there was about 10,000 that was kind of left over. And I think you had indicated that those students may have moved over to the special education category. And so when I kind of looked at just the numbers from fiscal year 2025 to fiscal year 2026, it does look like we have that increase in projected special education enrollment. One of the things that I did see, though, is then when we applied the 13% cap, we kind of suppress those kids down from about 7,000 students that now are not in any weighted category. And we're now not applying the additional, we took that 1.5 million out of each fiscal year to address the 13% cap. What is the plan for those 7,000 students that should probably be allocated some sort of weight? Like, where are they going to fall into?
Megan Peterson for the record. So that is when we would go back to the application of the filters that are used to determine those counts. And so if they were not identified then in a higher category, which in this case would be the EL count, and they were identified as at risk, then the at-risk count would be updated to reflect that appropriately.
I guess, I don't know if it would be a budget amendment or what we're gonna do, but, I look forward to kind of seeing that, because obviously that will adjust like what we're doing for our per pupil, calculation. Members, do we have any other questions for the department or GFO regarding this? Okay, with that, I thank you so much for your presentation, especially since you were sick. Thank you for moving us along those 3 different presentations. And so with that, we will go ahead and move to our last item on our agenda, which is public comment. And for ease, because we have more people I anticipate in Carson City wishing to give public comment, I will go ahead and start in Las Vegas, and that would allow those here in Carson City to start filling up the front. So welcome to our guest in Las Vegas, who can start us off with public comment this morning.
All right, I have FOMO. Everybody's up there and I'm the only one here. Okay, good morning, honorable chairs and members of the committee.
Morgan.
My name is Amanda Morgan.
Ms. Morgan, can you talk closer to the
Can you hear me?
microphone? I don't know if it's that or if we need AVH to turn up, but you're kind of quiet here for us in Carson City.
Here, I'll scoot it.
There you
Is that
go.
better?
That's perfect.
Okay. All right. Good morning, honorable chairs and members of the committee. My name is Amanda Morgan, AMANDA-MORGAN, and I'm the executive director of Educate Nevada Now. I've submitted more detailed written testimony, so I just want to bring up a couple items this morning. First and foremost, we have deep concerns with what we're hearing on the ground, which is that schools developing their budgets for next year with the proposed executive budget figures are having to make cuts to staff and services. This budget does not appear to honor the intent of the law, which is to increase new funding from the state general fund to the PCFP at a rate comparable to state revenue growth. Instead, it appears that teacher raises allocated last session are being moved into the PCFP, and it's being characterized as an increase, but it's essentially just relabeling those funds. The practical effect is schools will not see new funds and will experience cuts and larger class sizes. And those previously allocated raises are improperly being characterized as a tier 1 service to move them into the PCFP. And by law, tier 1 should only be food service, transportation, and similar services. Any effort to change this is just playing games to avoid their obligation. We urge the state to fund teachers and the intended increases in per pupil funding, and that's the only way we're going to meet the goals set forth by the Commission on School Funding. We are concerned that this budget does not move us forward, and apparently to the tune of $240 million. Thank you again for your commitment to Nevada students, and we look forward to what's to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Morgan. We'll go ahead and move to Carson City. Mr. Marks, we can start with you.
Good morning, Alexander Marks, MARKS with the Nevada State Education Association. In a cold rebuke of the Commission's work and progress you all made last session, the Governor's initial budget recommendation proposed to reduce the per pupil funding. In a recent hearing, they said funding will increase by just $2 per pupil. Instead of working to pass the plan, the Governor is prepared to write a $2 check for Nevada's kids. While this check is comical, the consequences are not. $2 won't keep up with inflation or the 3.5% PERS increase. It won't cover basic classroom supplies like pencils, crayons, and glue sticks. In 2022, the Commission on School Funding presented a clear research-backed roadmap to reach optimal funding within 10 years. Even after record increases to education funding last session, Nevada still trails the national average by more than $4,000 per student. That's why we say pass the plan, stay on track towards optimal funding, including making a $700 per pupil increase over the next 2 years. In 543 in 2019, the Governor is required to recommend increases to the education fund that mirror increases to the state general fund. This December, that number was 5.4 over the biennium. But instead of increasing the per pupil funding by this percentage, the Governor used budget sleight of hand, moving 231 monies from the state general fund to the education fund. While these monies are needed to sustain educator raises, this is not new money. This switch allowed the Governor to increase the education budget by a significantly lower rate, and this flies in the face of the legislative intent of 543. 2 years ago, we called for Time for 20, which raised concerns about the 231's one-time funding structure, which complicated bargaining and opened the door for the governor's sleight of hand creative budgeting. Still, progress was made, and many districts did secure 20% raises, but no continuing progress on educator retention is seen in this budget. With no consultation with the commission, it's no surprise the governor's budget is a step back in the progress you all made last session. We ask that you reject this cynical budgeting gimmick that is essentially a de facto cut in education. Instead, follow the commission's recommendations, close property tax loopholes, and update sales tax base. Pass the plan and ensure that Nevada can reach optimal funding in 10 years. Thank you.
Good morning, Chair Backus and members of the committee. My name is Carrie Finn, and I'm a clinical aide with the Carson City School District. I'm also the president of the Carson Educational Support Association and a member of the Senate Bill 71 Teacher and ESP Recruitment and Retention Task Force Committee. The following comments are my own personal views and do not reflect the opinion of the above groups mentioned. However, these concerns are widely shared by many within our public education system. Public schools serve 90% of Nevada students, and a strong public education system is crucial for addressing inequities in opportunity and resources. But when funding falls short, it leads to overcrowded classrooms, fewer staff, and outdated resources, ultimately leaving our most vulnerable students behind. A $2 increase per student is not enough, especially when Nevada is already $4,091 short per pupil. The gap is widening, and we need a substantial long-term investment in education. The Commission on School Funding's plan for a $700 per pupil increase will help retain quality educators and support staff while improving student achievement and strengthening Nevada's economy. We need to pass the plan. When educators are underfunded and overwhelmed, burnout is inevitable. This directly affects student outcomes and school culture. The rising cost of education and living makes it clear we need more progressive revenue sources, such as wealth tax, millionaire tax, and closing business tax loopholes. This is not just a budgetary issue, it's a morale imperative. We must invest in Nevada's children and ensure that every student and educator has the resources and support they need to thrive. I strongly urge you to support and pass the plan to ensure Nevada's education system continues to improve and that all of Nevada's students are given the opportunities they deserve. Thank you.
Good morning, members of the committee. My name is Sky Sessions, and I am a school counselor in Washoe County School District. This is my 21st year. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I'm also a proud member of the Washoe Education Association and a parent of 2 students going through our school district. I want to start by expressing my sincere gratitude for the investments you made in education during the last legislative session. These funds have created meaningful improvements in our schools, helping to increase academic and mental health supports, which have had a positive impact on student engagement. Thank you truly for your commitment to our students. I'm here today to urge you to continue with that commitment. Nevada remains well below the national average in per pupil funding. Before last session, Clark and Washoe counties were in the bottom 5% of districts nationally. This is why I'm concerned that the governor's proposed budget includes a base funding increase of only $2 per student. To put this in perspective, this calculator, it's used in my school daily, costs $10. This proposed increase wouldn't even cover 20% of this essential learning tool for a single student, let alone address inflation or required PERS contributions for employees. On a personal note, I struggle quite a bit with the reality that I cannot truly know all of the students on my caseload. I constantly worry that I'm inadequately supporting their vast needs. With counseling ratios in Nevada at an average of 450 to 1, and our state continuing to have the largest class sizes in the country, I know I am not alone. This unsettling statistic is compounded by the fact that we still have over 1,000 teaching vacancies statewide. If we want to be able to fill this massive gap with highly qualified educators, we must do more. The Commission on School Funding has provided a 10-year roadmap to reach optimal funding. I urge you to follow this plan. Our great state of Nevada demands a stronger future, and that future can only be achieved as a direct result of choosing to invest in our children. Thank you so much for your time and consideration, as well as for your hard work and advocacy.
Hello, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Maria Renee Costello, and I'm a proud public school teacher and a member of the Washoe Education Association, as well as the parent of 2 students in Washoe County. I hold a Bachelor's of Science in Education with an emphasis in English language learners and a Master of Science in STEM. I've been teaching for 8 years with experience ranging from kindergarten through 4th grade in both Nevada and in Idaho. Currently, I teach 3rd grade in Washoe County. First, I want to commend the legislature for the investments made in education during the last session. I've seen the positive impact these efforts have had, with many great teachers staying in the classroom because of it. Additionally, I've witnessed the great things happening in our schools. At my school, the allocation of funds has enabled tutoring services, the creation of various clubs such as art and running, and the organization of family events. These initiatives have been essential to community building and have made our school a place where students are excited to come every day. However, despite these positive steps, we continue to face a teacher shortage every year. While this is due to many factors, I want to focus on 2 key issues today: class sizes and funding. I know numerous teachers, myself included, who have questioned or have left the profession because of the overwhelming class sizes. Teaching a class of 30 students is incredibly challenging, and it's difficult to give each student the individual attention they need to succeed. If we want our students to grow and thrive, achieve their potential, we must prioritize capping class sizes. Even on our drive today, I was talking to my colleague and I was saying on a personal note how I don't know if I can do this for the next 33 years. Next, I want to address funding. The $2 increase per pupil, $2, is insufficient. It's important to note that in this economy, few classroom supplies cost less than $2. Essential items like expo markers and pencils that we use daily are often cost more than that and are often replenished throughout the year. In closing, as you consider the budget, I urge you to prioritize our students and our teachers. They are the future of Nevada, and we must do what's right for them. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lindsay Anderson. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak today, and thank you so much for your investment in public education. I've been teaching for 12 years, and 7 of those have been in Washoe County in Nevada. I have a multiple subject teaching credential in California and Nevada, a bachelor's degree in history, a master's degree in teaching English learners, and I'm a nationally board certified teacher. I'm a proud member of the Washoe Education Association. The 20% raise we received last year was monumental, and if I can be honest, one of the reasons I've remained teaching in Nevada. Over the past 3 years, I've been debating if I can continue in this profession with the amount of stress and the lack of compensation and support. I'm not alone in these feelings. Most of my coworkers feel the same way. We have over 1,000 teacher vacancies in our state, and we really can't afford to lose any more teachers. Last year, I taught 4th grade, and I had 35 students in my class. It was difficult to walk through my classroom because of the amount of bodies in there. Of my 35 students, 15% spoke 0 English, 67% were not yet English proficient. Over 75% of those kids came from homes that were not conducive to learning. 60% were considered far below grade level in reading and math, which means that in 4th grade they were working at a kindergarten, 1st, or possibly 2nd grade level. But every year we're told that we're not doing enough, that teachers need to do more. The proposed $2 per student increase is not enough. I don't know how $70 total is going to help that situation. It's not. A ream of paper costs closer to $10. Our students are capable, intelligent, and wonderful humans, but the sheer amount of them in our classes is impossible for teachers to help them reach their potential, and our students are continuing to fall behind. For education to work, there should never be more than 20 students in a classroom K through 12. Please help us to do better for our future. Thank you for your time.
Good morning, Madam Chair Backus and members of the committee. My name is Eva Reynolds, and I have the privilege of driving a school bus for the last 29 years. 27 of them here in Carson City. Most of that has been spent as a special education school bus driver. I am currently serve as the treasurer for the Carson Education Support Association, and I am the site representative for the transportation department. As a bus driver, I can tell you firsthand that every day my department, and probably every department who does transportation in this state, struggles to cover the routes due to the shortage of drivers. There are many times when we have to double and triple back just to ensure all the routes are covered and the kids get to school. This is a difficult and demanding job, yet we are not compensated with a living wage. Many of us, including myself, have taken on second and third jobs just to make ends meet. The cost of living continues to rise, but our wages stay stagnant. Retaining bus drivers and attracting new ones have become increasingly difficult, again, because of the low wages and the high-stress work environment. As a sped driver, I am responsible for the safety of my students. Yet, there have been many times because of staff shortages where I don't have the required bus aid on my bus. That means that I take on more responsibility, managing multiple runs a day, and ensure the safety of all my students, plus driving on the road. Without the support of an aide, the funding in our schools is simply not enough to meet the growing needs of our students. An increase of $2 will leave Nevada at the bottom of the list for student funding. We need more resources to provide our students with the opportunities they deserve and to support those of us who work hard to educate them. I urge you to pass the plan. Our children's future depend on it, and we cannot continue without the necessary funding to ensure their success. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everybody, senators, assembly members. My name is Drew Franklin, D-R-E-W-F-R-A-N-K-L-I-N. I'm here with the Washoe Education Association. I'm a special education teacher in Reno. Last session, I took a little bit of time off of teaching, and I got to come down here and spend the session with you all. It was a joy to watch, and I was very excited and pleased to see all the education bills go through. And I want to thank you all for all the hard work that was done. Like I said, I was very excited to see those get signed into law. On a personal note, it made it actually possible for me to live in the city that I grew up in and I teach in. There were steps in the right direction, for sure. But that being said, I've taught in juvenile detention, I've taught in our public schools, I've taught at Catholic schools. There's something in common with all of these, and it is just a simple lack of funding. We are lacking in a lot of different areas. I brought this laptop here to show you. This is the laptops that we have available to our students. We have carts of these. Not a 1-to-1 ratio, but pretty close. If the student chooses to use their cell phone instead of this laptop, they actually get more work done. It takes them 5, 10, sometimes 15 minutes just to get logged in and try to get to the right program. A lot of the times it won't work, it'll die, they'll have to go try to find a new one, and all of a sudden half of the class period is gone. I've asked IT what we can do about this to see maybe if we can get some replacements, maybe we can get rid of some programs, make these faster, and IT told me we shouldn't have these in the school, they're a security risk, and he said I actually can't help you with these at all. We have carts of laptops that don't get used because it's a waste of time. They're Macs, they're not even Apple laptops, they're that old that they're back when we called them Macs, and they just sit there all day. I look forward to working with all of you this session to hopefully make some more steps towards helping our students here in Nevada. Thank you all so much for your time.
Good morning. My name is Kelly Ferretti, and I am the Vice President of the Carson Educational Support Association, as well as an office manager at Carson Middle School. I have had the privilege of working for the Carson City School District for the past 10 years, during which time I have served at 3 different school sites and witnessed firsthand the ongoing changes and challenges. In my current role, I'm directly impacted by the increasing strain resulting from insufficient funding in our schools. On a daily basis, one of my responsibilities is to schedule and fill classrooms with substitute teachers when our educators are absent. For years, we have struggled with a severe shortage of substitute teachers, driven by inadequate pay and lack of benefits. As a result, our teachers are frequently required to cover classes during their prep periods, leaving them exhausted and unable to focus on their own responsibilities. This constant burden is taking a toll on staff morale and ultimately the quality of education that our students are receiving. In addition, the district has made significant cuts to crucial staff positions. At Carson Middle School, we now operate with 3 office staff to support 1,000 students and their families and 100 staff members. This immense workload has significantly increased my responsibilities, leaving me feeling overwhelmed and stressed much of the time. Despite the additional demands, I have not received any compensation for the extra work, nor am I permitted to work overtime. This expectation to complete more work within the same time frame for the same amount of pay is not only unsustainable, but has begun to negatively impact my job satisfaction and mental health. The rising cost of living continues to outpace the modest wage increases we have received. Moreover, with the proposed increase of just $2 per pupil for education, it is clear that our situation will only worsen if we do not take immediate action and pass the plan to increase funding for public education. Both our students and its dedicated staff who serve them will continue to face significant challenges. I strongly urge you to support the increase in funding for public education and pass the plan. Our students deserve the best educational experience, and our educators deserve the resources and support necessary to help them succeed. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Laura Winchester, Washoe Valley, and I'm a special education transition teacher at Marvin Piccolo Special Education School in Reno, and a member of the Washoe Education Association. I've been an educator for over 24 years, teaching across 5 states, and for the past 7 years, Nevada has been my home. Before joining Washoe County, I taught at Silver Sage Middle School in Lyon County. Beyond the classroom, I serve at several state special education committees, and I'm the vice president for the Nevada chapter of the Council for Exceptional Children Division of Career Development and Transition. Education runs deep in my family. I'm a 17th generation public educator. My great uncle was the first schoolmaster for the Boston Latin School, and my mother spent 49 years in special education. Therefore, I've been raised in this tradition. We've come a long way, and I'm grateful for the funding increases from the last legislative session. These changes have made a significant difference for students and teachers across the state. However, despite the progress, we still face these critical challenges in education. The most pressing issues affecting the students I serve and the educators I work with are recruiting and retaining special education staff, the shortage of adult support in classrooms, and Nevada's below average per pupil funding. The most urgent issue is the shortage of qualified special education staff. Across Nevada, as you know, and have heard many times stated, there are over 1,000 unfilled positions, most of those in special education. At my school, 6 out of 50 staff members are over the age of 60, and 3 retired teachers have been rehired to fulfill critical positions. This model is not sustainable. We need a workforce that consistently support our students. The second issue is a limited support of students for students in special education classrooms. In my classroom, I currently work with 6 students who require specific one-on-one support for both academics and daily living needs. I have only 2 additional adults to help. Ideally, each student would have their own assistant, but due to the shortage of qualified staff or applicants, we are unable to meet these needs. We cannot keep qualified people in the classroom if we don't offer competitive wages and support. Finally, Nevada's below per pupil average funding remains a significant obstacle. Special education students require specialized resources, but with the limited funding, we struggle to provide these students with the tools they need to succeed. Larger class sizes, fewer resources, limited access to assistive technologies hinder their progress. For example, this little piece of sponge tubing helps support my students feed themselves or write. They have mobility issues. They have dexterity issues. This little piece of sponge is over $9 on Amazon.
Ma'am, I'm so sorry.
my time.
And you just reminded me of something. I'm going to have you wrap up. The committee policies here on this committee is that public comments are given 2 minutes. And I know sometimes when we practice, we think they're 2 minutes, but they've kind of been going a little over. And I think we have a lot of people to present. But one key thing that I needed to tell everyone, anyone who has had a prop, our staff needs to get a photo of the prop. So we would ask that you let our committee assistant Lisa, I saw her take a photo before you leave the room. So when you're done presenting, do you mind walking by her desk so that she can take a photo if you plan to use a prop? So sorry to cut you off, but if we can move on to the next a person giving public comment, that'd be great.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Hello, Nevada State Legislators. My name is Madison Jackson. I'm an English teacher at Sparks High School, and I wanted to thank you for having me here today. I also wanted to thank you for the increase in funding in the last legislative session. The increase in wages have gone a long way towards critical teacher retention, and I've also seen the positive impact not only in my classroom and all the upgrades I've been able to make, but also in my school community, which is flourishing now more than ever. That being said, there are still moves that need to be made. Now, I did bring a prop, a box of pencils, 12 pencils, costs $3 on Amazon. Now, do you know how many pencils a student goes through in a week? A day, even? I'm not a math teacher, but even I know that the $2 suggested increase does not go towards meeting our needs. Clark and Washoe County are still in the bottom 5% of districts nationally for student funding. And I'm not being hyperbolic when I say these kids cannot read. There is a literacy crisis in our schools, and it cannot be solved by cutting funding and cutting critical positions. There's a direct correlation between student funding and student success, and there's also a direct correlation between classroom sizes and student success. Despite Nevada having the largest classroom sizes in the nation, I've been blessed this year with a couple of small classes, and let me tell you, the difference has been night and day. With a classroom of less than 20 children, I've been able to focus more on their writing, conference with them on their writing, have valuable conversations. I've been able to make positive phone calls home and conduct home visits. Children have been less distracted in an environment that is less chaotic. So I am quite literally out here in the trenches, dedicated to student success, but we need a legislative body that backs us because educators can only do so much to impart positive change without funding behind us. So I urge the legislator to meet the 10-year roadmap goals by the Commission on School Funding and to pass AB 155 to allow us to bargain for classroom sizes. And because I'm an English teacher, I will leave you with this final metaphor to think about. We cannot starve a garden and expect it to thrive. Thank you.
Madam Chair and members of the committee, my name is Carla Jost Reed, and I'm a teacher at Carson City Montessori Charter School. I'm also a parent of a 5th grade student who attends there. I'm here to attest to the uniqueness of our little school. Carson Montessori provides a quality education by an excellent, talented staff who share their knowledge beyond the classroom. Every staff member, not just the faculty, is a teacher and a leader. We instill in our students a sense of responsibility for their education, their building, and each other. Students are first responders, maintenance workers, and builders. The staff, the students, and the parents as well all contribute to make our school what it is. As a small, independent public charter school, we do not rely on any company funding for our budget. We are hardworking professionals who deserve to be compensated like our contemporaries in the district schools. It is our hope that this session will recognize that not all charter schools are alike, nor are their budgets. This year, Carson Montessori faces the added challenge of finding a new building as we experience growing pains. We are nestled in an area of Carson that is zoned for industrial business. As we search for a new building, we may have to temporarily downsize and eliminate grades. We are a dedicated, flexible staff, and we love our school. Knowing that we will be eligible to receive a competitive salary will help tremendously in keeping attrition at bay. We would like Carson Montessori, after being in existence for 20 years, to not be known as the little school that closed, but as the little school that could. We ask you to carefully consider your funding this session, and we invite you also, since we're in Carson City, to come by and see what we're all about. Thank you.
For the record, my name is Lily Chotter, and I am a member of Carson Montessori's student legislative team. Carson Montessori is a charter school that believes that the voice of the student must always be heard. Carson Montessori is a real-world, hands-on school. As you can see today, we students are pretty much involved in everything. Since we are talking about funding today, I am here to share a very special and unique funding program we have at Carson Montessori School that not only lets the voice of the students be heard, it gives everyone a chance, parents, staff, and even the committee to be heard. It is called the 48-hour launch. Anyone can submit a proposal, and if it is doable, workable, and feasible, it is implemented in 48 hours. But many times these proposals are funded personally by our principal. For example, we've received a buddy bench for part of our SEL program, but now we need a new facility, and funding is more important to us than ever. Please don't cut the funding to charter schools, and most of all, please give the salary benefits to charter schools. Once again, due to all of our schools' costs going up, please do more. $2 is not enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Backus. My name is AJ Fueling. I'm currently the superintendent for the Carson City School District. I am the secretary-treasurer for the Nevada Association of School Superintendents, and I am a former member of the Commission on School Funding. I served in that capacity for about 3 years. Some of the numbers I'm going to discuss here are based off, just so we know where they're coming from, off the Governor's Executive Budget Book Amendment 10, which I believe is the most current numbers that we have. And just to start to compare last year, or I guess it's really this current year, to what we're looking at for the next year, fiscal year 26, the biennium, to make it apples to apples, you need to remove the SB 231 salary adjustment funds to really see what is actually comparably happening between those 2 years. When you do that, you will see that the PCFP is effectively cannibalizing itself due to a lack of funding. The examples, the total adjusted base funding, which is the core piece of what school funding is in the PCFP, is actually being reduced by almost $50 million. At-risk funding, as was mentioned, is being reduced by about $43 million. Local special education funding is going up about $113 million. So there's this back and forth going on, but in total PCFP funding, the entire thing is increasing by about $36 million, which is a 0.63% increase. Specifically, when you look at it this way, Clark County School District, some of you may have heard of them, that their PCFP funding is actually dropping by $8.3 million. We are looking at the 3.25% PERS increase. It's going from 33.5 to 36.75. We are estimating that as a cost of approximately $120 million. And think of that in comparison to a $36 million increase in total for the PCFP. And just as a point of comparison, in 2003, that percentage was 18.75. That has been a dramatic impact on all public entities, school districts as well. Not considering the other cost inflation that we otherwise see, think of the downward pressure that is putting onto school districts. That SB 231, the salary adjustment money, helps maybe bring that back, but think of that as a total impact. There are implications with that. while it is, the PCFP is a revenue-driven model, and you've seen all the revenues that go into the state education fund, the one that there is discretion over is the state general fund appropriation. In 1970, 46.1% of the entire state's general fund was an appropriation to K-12 education. In fiscal year 24, that draw is now down to 28.9%.
Superintendent, I'm gonna have you wrap up, but I don't know if you submitted written materials. Your data is really interesting. If you don't mind submitting it in writing, that'd be fantastic.
I can.
Thank you so much.
10 seconds. Thank you. So with all of this, the Commission on School Funding was created in 2019. I was blessed to be a part of that. You have a report from 2022 and 2024 basically saying the same things. We just need someone to have the will to do something with that information. Thank you very much.
Good morning. My name is Chad Foley. I have taught for 30 years in Nevada, so I'm towards the end of my career. But as a dedicated educator for over 25 years, traditional school setting in the last 5 years at Mariposa Academy, I'm committed to providing an education for our students that meet the academic needs and values culture through our biliteracy focus. This model is essential for our students' academic success and future opportunities. Our staff provides a rigorous and enriching setting where students typically perform above their peers at similarly situated schools across the state. Compensating staff at public charter schools equitably with other public school educators is not only essential to respecting and valuing the profession, but is essential for our families to know that their children in public school matter. Supporting equitable pay is crucial to maintaining the high-quality instruction our students need and values the students and their families who attend a charter school. With rising operational costs, including but not limited to a 3% PERS increase, flat funding for education is effectively a budget cut, making it even harder to retain experienced staff. Investing in fair salaries ensures we can continue empowering all students in public schools in Nevada with the skills necessary to thrive in a multilingual world. Thank you for supporting our schools.
Good morning, everybody. My name is David Jorez, and as a parent at Mariposa Language and Learning Academy, I have seen firsthand the dedication and impact of the teachers and staff. I choose Mariposa for my 3 children because the staff provides an exceptional educational experience with a focus on biliteracy that nurtures both academic success and cultural pride. It is important to me that they be respected and valued in the profession for their hard work and commitment, and are compensated equally to their public school counterparts. Equitable pay is essential to retaining these outstanding educators and ensuring our children to continue to receive the high-quality education they deserve. My children's public school education matters, and the staff that support them matter. Equitable compensation for the staff at Mariposa shows respect for me as a parent and sends a clear message to our 95% Hispanic families that our students and educators in all public schools deserve fair and equitable funding. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Jenny Hunt, and I am the director of Mariposa Language and Learning Academy, and we are a district-sponsored Title I charter school that is self-managed. We serve 191 students who are 95% Hispanic, 40% EL, and 100% free and reduced lunch. I've had the fortune to be a part of the last legislative sessions, and I first want to thank you for all that you've done in support of public education in Nevada. Mariposa has been one of the top-performing Title I schools and continues to be amid funding adjustments for salaries, weighted funding, and per-pupil support fluctuations over the years. As I'm sure you are aware, we do not receive receive public capital funding for public charter schools, among other different funding differences. Following the last legislative session, Mariposa valued our public school staff, and we dedicated ourselves to providing equitable pay for our staff to meet the funds dedicated through SB 231 that omitted charters. Our teacher licensure rates mirrored the districts in Nevada. We were resourceful in order to honor and respect the profession with equitable pay, but this is not sustainable over time. As many of you have shared today, I have intense concern about the lacking clarity around budget detail levels and the huge impact that this has on our ability to plan to support the needs of our students. We look forward to further information, and we thank you for your commitment to the school, to our schools, and to our students. I implore you to ensure equitable education funding across the state, across public school settings, across all student demographics, across all voters, and all taxpayers. As you know, our students are the future, and as evidenced in the data that was presented today, the students in Nevada are accessing their public education across the state in very different public school settings, and they deserve equitable access to funding their future. Thank you so much for your time.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Justin Juvianis. This is my 15th year in education and my 9th as a teacher, all in special education. I am also a building representative for the Washoe Education Association. I currently teach in a self-contained program called Comprehensive Life Skills at Marcyhurst Middle School. I have a great passion and love for students who are placed in self-contained programs, who spend most of their day away from their general education peers due to their severe deficits in academics, communication, and adaptive behavior. Thank you for all your efforts last session to invest in education. This allowed our bargaining unit to agree to a contract that gave us a 20% raise and 2 substantial bonuses in June 2024 and 2025 for all special education staff members. Having this raise allows me to support my family and pay for my daughter's daycare. In addition, it also gives my colleagues hope that our profession might finally be going in the right direction. Despite the improvements in teacher working conditions, we still have many challenges ahead of us. Nevada is still well below the national average in per pupil funding by thousands of dollars. Our state still has the largest class sizes in the country. When you were in school, were you learning in classrooms that had 35, 40, or 45 students? That's what's happening right now. The benefits of reducing class sizes allows better instruction, the students have a strong connection in their learning, and their teacher will give more meaningful feedback to the students that really need it. Throughout my time in Washoe County School District, I have learned and grown so much as an educator and as a person because of the wonderful teachers I've collaborated with. Their passion and love for teaching is unmatched. Our special education teachers work tirelessly in making sure students catch up their peers by providing intensive instruction, accommodation, and emotional support. However, more special education teachers are quitting or becoming general education teachers because the job is becoming too demanding. This is very problematic for our students with disabilities that need stability and structure. It is my duty to come to work every day to work with students with and without disabilities to meet the state standards in academics. It is your duty to continue investing in our schools so we can hire more teachers and reduce our class sizes. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Bonnie Carlson, and I would much rather be in front of my elementary school students than speaking to adults. Also, I'm thinking it's about time you probably need a brain break as well. So I'm going to give you some really positive things to listen to. Thank you for allowing me to speak to you today. It's because of your extreme generosity that I and many of our colleagues are continuing the career that we love every single day. So thank you from the bottom of my teaching heart. And it's an extremely deep place to come from. I'm a native Nevadan. My daughter went through the school system here. I will be speaking on behalf of my grandson and my great-grandson. I'm one of the old teachers. I'm 63. I'm not retiring until I feel like I'm ready to. I love what I do. I have a covered wagon in my classroom. Why can I do that? Because I have 18 students. A covered wagon where they can read under or over because they understand that's how when they traveled, they read under or played under or slept under the wagon. I've been a public school teacher for 24 years. I'm the first one in my family to have a college degree, the first one with a master's degree, and the only one as a national board certified teacher. My students are so proud that I'm here today speaking to you as a 4th grade teacher to represent them, and they wish they could be here. I wanted to tell you about them because I had them write sticky notes about what they wanted me to say to you. And the most important thing they wanted me to tell you was that it's so much easier having a small class size. They want you to know they feel calmer and more engaged. They want you to know that I am blessed by having a small class size. I'm able to provide one-on-one teaching and small group teaching. I want you to know that every single student in my classroom is above the 50th percentile in reading. Every single one. Every single one of my students is above the 50th percentile in math, except for one, which is at the 46th percentile. I volunteer tutor before school 3 hours a week. I am so happy to do it. The mathletes are killing it. In addition, I wanted you to know that I feel that every person should have the opportunity, not just as a teacher, but as a person, to get a text in the middle of the night from Ireland from a student you had in 3rd grade who just got her MCAT results to let you know that she believes the reason that she soared on MCATs was because I was her 3rd grade teacher and taught her the value of reading. I could not speak just more positively about the career that I have and the hope that I have as I've come to speak to you for the first time ever, knowing that I'm hoping to never come back to have to speak on behalf of a great grandson. I just thank you for letting me speak, and that's what I'd love to say. So thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Aaron Schuler, and I'm a math teacher at Hug High School in Sparks in Washoe County. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today. At Hug, I teach financial math, and when I first got to where I teach the value of investments, so amongst other things. And when I first got to Hug, it was about the same time as the substantial increase in funding allocated by the state this past session. And I immediately noticed this substantial increase in my day-to-day. You know, gone were the days of having to order classroom supplies through the principal's secretary on a meager budget or needing a GoFundMe to provide calculators for my classroom. The immediacy of having these things in the classroom on demand has had a tremendous impact on my students. Investments, both financial and educational, are some things that we talk about with my students in financial math. I was disappointed to learn, of course, that the governor's proposed budget for education amounts to an increase of only $2 per student. And $2 doesn't buy a whole lot of classroom supplies. It's only enough to buy about half of one whiteboard eraser. I was going to cut a whiteboard eraser in half and bring it here to you, but I need that eraser. So our imagination is going to have to suffice. Beyond supplies, in my classroom, I have many students who have special education needs or have English learning needs, and it's very challenging to meet these needs when my class sizes are upwards of 38 students. Nevada has some of the highest class sizes in the nation, and that is owed in large part to the over 1,000 teacher vacancies in the state. There simply aren't enough teachers to go around. And this isn't for a lack of people wanting to become teachers. Instead, as we do in financial math, people are making the cost-benefit calculation and seeing that it's just not financially feasible to become a teacher or to enter the profession. So to conclude, I'd like to thank the legislature for its efforts to support education and encourage further investment into our children and the prosperity of Nevada. Thank you.
Good morning, committee members. Thank you for your time. My name is Eduardo Martinez on behalf of the Nevada Charter School Association, and I'm just here to say that we support public school charters, teachers also being included in the raises that were being discussed today. Thank you.
My name is Brent Busboom. I'm a 26-year teacher, 23 of them at Reno High School. I'm also a proud member of the Washoe Education Association. Last session, the legislature made a meaningful commitment to education, approving historic funding that kept pace with equally historic levels of inflation. But in a system that's been underfunded for decades, keeping pace with inflation isn't the same as progress. Today, I want to give you one example of what these decades of neglect have looked like at my school. When I started Reno High School in 2002, our English department had 16 teachers. Today, despite having more students at our school, we have 12. And that's not all we cut. To keep core classes from sizes from exploding, we've cut electives, including theater. Theater was a home for a certain kind of kid, the kid who needed a reason to come to school. But as funding lagged, our theater classes started disappearing. 5 periods became 4, then 3,
then one, then it became a club, and now it's gone entirely. Every year, I see students who rarely come to school, students who would if they had classes like theater. Here's the deal. Education funding follows the same tragic pattern we see with many disasters. Experts speak up, fixes are known, action arrives too late. Think Hurricane Katrina, the 2008 financial crisis, the LA fires, the DC plane collision. We imagine disasters as sudden events, but far too often, they're slow motion catastrophes. Schools don't collapse overnight. Theater programs don't suddenly disappear. What happens is we normalize decay. Larger class sizes become the norm. Teacher shortages go from shocking to expected. Students fall further behind. Until one day, a system we thought could be held together with empty promises and goodwill simply stops working. We have a solution. It's one created by the experts appointed by this legislature. But just like those levees, those markets, those fires, those planes, it's in danger of being ignored. The only question is whether the legislature will act before the collapse or after. Thank you.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, I apologize, I have a little bit of a scratchy voice this morning. I first want to just thank you for your commitment to all students in Nevada. Oh, for the record, my name, thank you, is Ben Contine. I'm with the Honors Academy of Literature, as we call it, HAL. I've been an educator all in Nevada for nearly 20 years, having worked in the Clark County School District, as well as the Carson City School District. I can tell you at HAL, I have found supremely qualified, more than dedicated teachers who work miracles every day with the funding that they're provided. And I have to be honest, in my work with traditional public schools, what I found was supremely qualified educators who are more than dedicated, who work miracles every day with the funding they are provided. We stand in concert, in unity with all educators and all students in Nevada. I want to thank all educators who took the time to testify today, and those who are in their classrooms. I want to thank the Washoe Education Association. I see some folks from the Carson City Association as well here. I want to thank them for all their work. Our school was founded by two local educators who met each other in the UNR doctoral program. They had a dream 13 years ago to open up a small, personalized school that was family first. That dream has come to fruition. That said, when we were left out of the funding for teacher pay increases last year, it felt like a slap in the face to the work that our teachers do every day and to the families that we serve. So I won't echo all of the concerns about the budget. We share them. But what I will say is that we are advocating strongly for pay equity, and that all teachers who are teaching Nevada students should be provided equal funds. Thank you.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Sarah Adler with Silver State Government Relations, and I represent a coalition of small independent charter schools in northern Nevada. And I want to commend several of you for your attention to how this proposed Tier 1 allocation of funds will work. I want to inform you that Washoe County School District is the authorizer for 7 charters, Carson City School District the authorizer for 1 charter. So these, as you figure out how to flow funds through Tier 1 or through another mechanism for salary equity, we offer our assistance in making sure that those charters are not ignored. Sadly, Washoe County School District inequitably flowed through ESSER funds in the past and title funds currently. So we really need to be part of this conversation. Just want to make 3 quick notes. Charters are public school choice, made by parents as best fit for their kids. When kids do enter charters, they lower the costs for district schools to some extent. Although district schools have fixed costs, there is some assistance to district schools there. And then many of you recognize the validity of the 2020 baseline as supporting districts that lack economy of scale and yet have fixed costs. This is the role of charters, who themselves pay for their own facilities. And finally, I have something sad to share with you. I'm a passionate follower of the Commission on School Funding. I love your attention to it as well. At the Nevada Taxpayers Dinner last night, I sat next to two officials from the Nevada Department of Taxation who have not read Chapter 2, pages 12 through 57 of the CSF report. Neither had the president of the Nevada Taxpayers Association. So I love that you're broadcasting the importance of their work, and we thank you. Let us know if we can help. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, we will go up to our phone lines. AVH, do we have anyone on the phone lines wishing to give public comment today?
If you would like to provide public comment, please press *9 now to take your place in the queue.
My name is Susan Kaiser. Nevada Public Schools educational results reflect what state funding has paid for. We are perennially at the bottom of the nation in per pupil funding and with the largest class sizes in the nation. The increased funding in the last biennium should be the start to following the plan recommended by the Commission on School Funding, not a one-time infusion. This funding reduced teacher attrition and will improve student learning environments in the future. I am a middle school science teacher with a BS in biology, a master's degree, and I am also national board certified. My teaching certificate is valid until 2026, but I retired before the pandemic. At that time, in addition to teaching my 180 students, I was the science department leader, the science safety officer, the school garden coordinator for a 10,000 square foot school garden, and after school garden club leader. Then my administrator told me I would have to serve on the MTSS committee. They required every teacher to be at weekly meetings without exception. My story is not unique, but it is our children whose futures are being shortchanged. I am no longer in the classroom, but I am here today providing public comment because I have a passion for Nevada's public schools. I have seen firsthand the power of learning and the doors that open for Nevada's kids when they have highly qualified teachers and support services they need to become our future flourishing adults. Last session, after attending a hearing in person, I exited the building and passed a demonstration table staffed by Desert Research Institute scientists. One of the scientists present was one of my former students from 12 years prior. Nevada's public schools and employees are up to the task, but they must have consistent, adequate long-term funding to show results. I implore you today, do not delay. Pass this plan recommended by the Commission on School Funding. Thank you.
Thank you. Next caller.
Good morning. My name is Philip Kaiser, K-A-I-S-E-R. I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak to the committee. I gave over 20 years of my life to Nevada students as a teacher, and I wonder, what would you give to have every student graduate from high school career or college ready? What would you give to have a highly qualified teacher in every classroom? What would you give to have enough special ed aides and teachers so that every child's needs were met? What would you give to have fewer fights because class sizes were smaller and teachers and counselors could build better relationships with students? Would you give as much as has been given to Tesla, $1.3 billion since 2014? Would you give as much as was given to Raiders Stadium, $750 million, and the A's Stadium, $380 million, And that's before you consider the incentives requested by movie studios, because that amount is what Nevada schools need over a decade to reach the national average in per pupil funding, according to the Commission on School Funding. Currently, Nevada's per pupil funding is $4,000 per student, below the national average. That session was a great first step in education funding, moving us from 48th to about 46th in the country. Let's keep the ball rolling past the plan of the School Funding Commission to bring Nevada up to the national average.
If you have just joined us and would like to provide public comment, please press star 9 now to take your place in the queue.
Good morning, Chair and members of the committee. My name is Erica Nungaray, ERICA-NUNGARAY, and I am an employee support professional for the Clark County School District. In our last legislative session, we made strides in funding education. However, despite significant contributions, existing gaps remain. While we begin the process of closing these gaps in the per pupil funding, the work is far from complete. An increase of $700 per pupil is not optional, it's essential. Anything less from our leaders would be a disservice toward Nevada's education system. Reducing funding is not just a budget cut, it is a setback, undoing the progress we have made. Consider what the funding means for students in my community. It could secure a school bus drivers for students who currently walk 3 miles to school or take public transportation at 5 a.m. in the dark. It could reduce class sizes in our most critical elementary schools, strengthening the foundation of our students' education. It could provide thriving wages for support staff, allowing us to focus on roles instead of working multiple jobs to support our families. It could offer competitive salaries to attract and retain qualified educators. Education is like a car. If you don't put fuel in it, you're not going anywhere. Fully funding our schools is not a choice, it's a necessity. The Commission of School Funding has provided a clear roadmap to reach optimal funding, and I urge this body to follow that plan. Thank you.
Chair, there are no additional callers choosing to provide public comment at this time.
Thank you so much. Are there any comments from members before we adjourn? Seeing no further business before us, the meeting is adjourned.